The summer of 1942 represented a pivotal moment of overconfidence for Adolf Hitler and the German Wehrmacht. They had swept across the Soviet Union in the initial phases of Operation Barbarossa, seizing vast swathes of territory and resources. The new campaign, Operation Case Blue, aimed to crush Soviet resistance and secure the oil fields of the Caucasus, a vital economic target for the war machine. Hitler became fixated on the city of Stalingrad, named for his ideological nemesis, Joseph Stalin. He saw the capture of Stalingrad not just as a strategic necessity, but as a massive propaganda victory that would shatter the Soviet will to fight. The German leadership expected a swift campaign, believing the city would fall within a matter of weeks, mirroring their successes in other major Soviet cities. The Wehrmacht's initial advances were stunning, slicing through the weaker Soviet defenses with the precision and speed of blitzkrieg. German morale was sky high. They believed they were on the cusp of final victory in the East, a short, sharp operation before winter set in. The troops envisioned a final, grand parade through the captured city streets before being transferred back to a comfortable winter camp. Logistical lines were stretched, however, a problem the German high command repeatedly ignored in the pursuit of the final, decisive blow. The vastness of the Russian steppe continued to consume men, fuel, and vehicles at an unsustainable rate. The focus on Stalingrad diverted crucial resources from the primary goal of securing the Caucasian oil, ultimately proving to be a catastrophic strategic error. The Germans' contempt for the Red Army's ability to defend the city and launch a counteroffensive would soon prove to be their undoing. The early belief that Stalingrad was merely another tactical obstacle, easily overcome, blinded them to the monumental, brutal fight that was about to unfold. The obsession with one city would ultimately tie down and destroy the pride of the German Sixth Army, a force they could ill afford to lose. The sun-drenched plains and the clear skies of summer gave no hint of the brutal, frozen hellscape the city was destined to become. The hubris of the German leadership was perhaps their most dangerous enemy, a fatal flaw in their grand military strategy. They were marching into a trap of their own making, lured by the symbolic name of a city they thought they could easily conquer. Their initial operational orders grossly underestimated the Soviet commitment to hold the city at any cost. The fate of the entire Eastern Front was about to be decided on the banks of the Volga River, far from the anticipated weeks-long capture. Stalingrad was a crucial industrial and transportation hub, stretching for miles along the western bank of the Volga River. The city's importance lay in its large factories, which produced the T-34 tank and various armaments essential for the Soviet war effort. More critically, its position on the Volga made it a vital lifeline for shipping oil and supplies from the Caucasus to the rest of the USSR. Losing Stalingrad would have effectively severed the Volga transport artery and dealt a crushing blow to Soviet logistics and morale. As the Germans advanced, the Soviets began a hasty, desperate evacuation of civilians and industrial equipment, yet many remained. The German air assault by the Luftwaffe in late August 1942 was unprecedented in its ferocity, turning most of the city into a smoldering ruin. This initial bombing ironically aided the Soviet defenders by creating a perfect landscape for urban warfare. The rubble and shattered buildings provided excellent cover for snipers, small defensive units, and concealed machine gun nests. The battlefield evolved from open-field armored warfare into a nightmarish labyrinth of concrete, twisted steel and broken bricks. German armored units, accustomed to rapid movement across the plains, were suddenly bogged down and vulnerable to close-range anti-tank attacks. The concept of a front line evaporated as fighting occurred street by street, house by house, and even room by room, turning every structure into a fortress. Soviet soldiers, reinforced by hurriedly conscripted workers and citizens, were ordered to hold their ground with a fanatical determination. Stalin's Order Number 227, the "not one step back" directive, was enforced with brutal efficiency, pushing the Red Army to desperate resistance. The Soviets quickly adapted their tactics, specializing in close-quarters combat, where German air superiority and tank advantages were nullified. They became masters of the Rattenkrieg, or Rat War, a term the Germans themselves coined to describe the brutal, subterranean fighting in the ruins. The once proud, orderly German attack devolved into a grinding, costly battle of attrition for every shattered street corner. The expectation of a quick victory vanished as the days stretched into weeks of continuous, devastating urban fighting. This shift in the character of the battle consumed German manpower and resources at an alarming, unexpected pace. The strategic importance of Stalingrad was now equaled only by its symbolic value as a crucible for the entire Eastern Front. The fight for the city became a massive sinkhole for both German operational strength and the collective psychological state of the Wehrmacht. The fighting inside Stalingrad transformed warfare into a relentless, brutal contest of endurance and will, unprecedented in the war's history. The conflict was characterized by a lack of maneuver, a constant, attritional struggle known as Rattenkrieg, which favored the Soviet defenders. German troops found their training for lightning warfare completely useless in the destroyed landscape of the factories and apartment blocks. The vast Red October steel plant, the Barikady gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory became key battlegrounds, each fought over for weeks. Soldiers often fought with hand grenades and shovels in the cellars and sewer networks, where the line between life and death was razor thin. Snipers became legendary figures on both sides, with the Soviet marksman Vasily Zaitsev embodying the defense's deadly precision. His reported duels with German counterparts became a massive part of Soviet propaganda, boosting the morale of the defenders immensely. The Soviet embrace tactic involved keeping the German lines so close that the Luftwaffe could not risk bombing or strafing, limiting air support. This proximity forced the Germans to fight on Soviet terms, negating their traditional strengths in artillery and air power coordination. German supply lines into the city were constantly harassed by small, mobile Soviet assault groups, masters of utilizing the rubble for cover. The destruction of the city meant that every structure had to be individually cleared, a process that cost the Wehrmacht dearly in terms of time and men. Every floor, every room, every pile of bricks became a contested position that could conceal a hidden Soviet machine gun or anti-tank rifle. The psychological toll on the German soldiers was immense. They were fighting a ghost enemy who seemed to materialize from the ruins and disappear just as quickly. They were perpetually under threat, never feeling secure, even when holding ground, due to the fluid, non-linear nature of the combat. The initial German confidence had been replaced by a gnawing weariness and the terrifying realization of the battle's relentless cost. The Soviet forces showed an almost superhuman tenacity, reinforced by the belief that they were defending not just a city, but the very future of their nation. The relentless noise of battle, the stench of blood and decaying bodies, and the constant fear created an environment of living hell. German operational focus became completely rigid, with Field Marshal Paulus repeatedly requesting permission for tactical withdrawals that Hitler continuously denied. This insistence on holding every piece of ground, regardless of the cost, ensured the German Sixth Army was utterly committed to the urban bloodbath. The battle for a single, unremarkable apartment building, known to history as Pavlov's house, epitomizes the brutal nature of the urban fighting in Stalingrad. This four-story residential block overlooked a key square and provided a strategic firing position commanding a wide view toward the Volga River. A reconnaissance platoon under Sergeant Yakov Pavlov secured the building in late September 1942, finding a dozen civilians hiding in the basement. Pavlov's initial squad was quickly reinforced and sustained by a multinational unit of 25 Soviet soldiers, representing many of the Soviet Union's ethnicities. For 58 days, this small garrison held the structure against continuous, devastating German attacks, turning the building into an impregnable fortress. The defenders rigged the building with barbed wire, anti-tank mines, and countless machine gun positions in all the shattered windows. They maintained a precarious supply line via trenches and tunnels connecting them to the main Soviet positions on the riverbank. The building became a symbol of Soviet resistance, showcasing the sheer will and ingenuity of the Red Army in close-quarters defense. German forces launched numerous assaults, employing tanks, infantry, and heavy artillery, but could never dislodge the tenacious defenders. The defenders' coordinated fire from multiple vantage points created overlapping fields of fire that shredded any German advance. The soldiers lived in unimaginable conditions, sharing meager rations, water, and ammunition while surrounded by the constant roar of battle. The civilians in the basement survived the entire ordeal, protected by the soldiers who fought above them, a testament to shared human resilience. The German command considered the building a major thorn in their side, an agonizing and humiliating impediment to their overall offensive. Legend states that the Germans spent more men and material taking Pavlov's house than they did capturing Paris during the entire 1940 French campaign. While likely an exaggeration, the story perfectly captures the disproportionate effort the Wehrmacht was forced to expend on every single structure. The defense of Pavlov's house embodied the strategic principle that every building could become a small, isolated fortress capable of tying down significant enemy forces. The building's tenacious hold provided invaluable time for the main Soviet forces to consolidate their defenses and prepare for the coming counteroffensive. The story of the small, diverse unit holding its ground against a massive army resonated deeply throughout the Soviet Union and among the defenders. It transformed an ordinary apartment block into a national legend, representing the unwavering, ultimate victory of the defender's spirit. As the fighting dragged into late autumn, the German strategic situation in Stalingrad became increasingly precarious, yet the command remained fixated on taking the city. The German Sixth Army pushed deeper into the city, but their vulnerability was growing, particularly on their long, exposed flanks held by weaker Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian allied forces. The onset of the harsh Russian winter brought the grinding urban combat to a new level of misery and operational difficulty. The Wehrmacht had failed to equip its troops for the extreme cold, lacking proper winter clothing, fuel, and medical supplies. The turning point was Operation Uranus, the massive Soviet counteroffensive launched on November 19, 1942, against the poorly equipped flanks. The Soviet attack achieved total surprise, shattering the Axis Allied lines and rapidly driving deep behind the German Sixth Army. Within 4 days, the Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach on Don, effectively trapping over 250,000 German, Romanian, and Croatian Axis soldiers in the Stalingrad pocket, or Kessel. Hitler, in his characteristic stubbornness, immediately ordered the Sixth Army to hold its ground and to fight as a fortress without any attempt at a breakout. He promised the trapped army that the Luftwaffe would create an air bridge to supply them with the 600 to 700 tons of supplies they needed daily. The reality was far different. The Luftwaffe simply did not have the transport capacity or the favorable weather conditions to sustain such a massive operation. The primary transport aircraft, the venerable Junkers Ju-52, was ill-equipped for the deep Russian winter and the constant harassment from the newly reinforced Soviet Air Force. A major air transport group was quickly assembled, but the average daily delivery to the Sixth Army never exceeded 100 tons, a fraction of the minimum required to keep the army effective. German airfields outside the Kessel were frequently attacked, and the landing strips inside the pocket were often under Soviet artillery fire, making operations incredibly risky. Transport planes were shot down with alarming regularity by Soviet fighters and ground fire, and many crashed simply due to poor visibility and extreme icing conditions. The delivered supplies often consisted of the wrong materials, such as thousands of pairs of summer boots, or were simply dropped into no man's land due to pilot error and the weather. The failure of the promised air bridge was a decisive factor, slowly starving the trapped German soldiers of ammunition, food, and crucial winter gear. The dream of a quick air rescue and resupply turned into a nightmare of constant air losses and the slow, inevitable decline of the Sixth Army's fighting capability. The Luftwaffe, led by Hermann Göring, had promised a miracle, but all they delivered was a few crumbs, consigning the largest German force to a frozen fate. The Soviet counteroffensive, codenamed Operation Uranus, was a stroke of strategic genius executed by the Soviet High Command, primarily Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The success was born of a massive, secret buildup of reserves and material far from the German front lines throughout the autumn of 1942. Zhukov and his planners correctly identified the weakest links in the Axis defensive chain, the flanks north and south of the German Sixth Army, held by Romanian forces. These Romanian and other Allied units were less well-equipped, less mobile, and had lower morale compared to the veteran German troops inside the city. The Soviets amassed enormous reserves of artillery, infantry, and new tank corps, particularly the battle-proven T-34 medium tanks. The attack was launched on November 19, 1942, under the cover of a dense snowstorm, which grounded the German Luftwaffe and provided the element of complete surprise. The Soviet forces attacked with overwhelming numbers, using massive artillery bombardments to shatter the Romanian positions almost instantly. The armored thrusts of the newly formed tank armies quickly broke through the shattered lines and drove deep into the German rear. The speed of the Soviet advance was breathtaking, replicating the classic blitzkrieg strategy that the Germans themselves had perfected. German command was completely stunned by the scale and the direction of the attack, having been utterly preoccupied with the close combat inside Stalingrad itself. Hitler and Field Marshal Paulus initially refused to believe the seriousness of the breakthrough, viewing it as a mere raid rather than a decisive encirclement attempt. The Soviet spearheads, driving north and south, had a single objective: to meet near the town of Kalach, thereby trapping the entire Sixth Army. The speed of the encirclement prevented any coordinated German withdrawal or the establishment of a robust new defensive perimeter. The two Soviet pincers successfully met on November 23rd, completing the ring and sealing the fate of over 250,000 Axis soldiers. This immediate and total success was a massive psychological victory for the Soviet Union and a crushing defeat for German operational planning. Operation Uranus demonstrated that the Red Army had learned from its earlier disastrous defeats and could now execute complex, large-scale combined arms operations. The counterpunch not only encircled the Sixth Army, but also completely destabilized the entire German southern front, forcing a major retreat. It marked the moment the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front permanently passed from the German High Command to the Soviet Union. The trapped German troops in the Kessel suddenly realized that they were no longer the hunters, but the desperately besieged prey. The closing of the ring around the German Sixth Army, the event known as the creation of the Kessel or cauldron, was a moment of profound psychological shock. Over 250,000 German and Axis troops were suddenly cut off, surrounded by a burgeoning Soviet steel wall on the frozen Russian steppes. The initial reaction among the German rank and file was confusion, which quickly descended into a deep-seated fear and realization of their plight. The troops' dependence on the Luftwaffe to keep the air bridge open and their hope for an immediate armored breakout became their primary focus. The Soviet forces immediately began consolidating their positions, reinforcing the perimeter with multiple defensive belts, making a breakout increasingly difficult. The landscape within the Kessel quickly became a frozen wasteland, characterized by massive drifts of snow, intense cold, and a rapid deterioration of all services. Ammunition, particularly for heavy weapons, was rationed severely, forcing the Germans to conserve their dwindling offensive power. Food supplies were the most critical issue, with rations shrinking dramatically each day, leading to widespread starvation and the inevitable consumption of horse meat. The freezing temperatures, plummeting far below zero, caused rampant frostbite, hypothermia, and non-combat injuries, rapidly depleting the available fighting force. Medical supplies were non-existent, leading to the agonizing death of thousands of wounded soldiers in makeshift, overcrowded field hospitals. The German command, under Field Marshal Paulus, was paralyzed by conflicting orders from Hitler, who forbade any attempt to break out to the west. Hitler's promise of the air bridge created a false sense of security and a tragic commitment to holding the position at all costs. The psychological warfare waged by the Soviets, including constant radio broadcasts detailing the hopelessness of their situation, began to take its toll. The inability to evacuate the wounded or receive proper food and warmth led to a massive and rapid drop in morale among the trapped troops. The once mighty Sixth Army, the spearhead of the German advance, was now a static, frozen, and slowly dying garrison. The Kessel represented a complete strategic reversal for Germany, transforming a triumphant offensive into a catastrophic defensive operation. Every day the pocket held out, the conditions became more desperate, and the chances of a successful relief or escape dwindled to nothing. The Sixth Army was being sacrificed on the altar of Hitler's political stubbornness, a decision that would haunt the Wehrmacht for the rest of the war. Following the successful Soviet encirclement, a desperate German effort was mounted to break the ring and rescue the trapped Sixth Army. This relief attempt, codenamed Operation Winter Storm, Unternehmen Wintergewitter, was entrusted to Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. Manstein, an exceptionally talented strategist, assembled a mixed force primarily composed of the newly formed LVI Panzer Corps, including the formidable 6th and 23rd Panzer Divisions. The operation was launched on December 12, 1942, aiming to punch a hole through the Soviet lines and link up with the Sixth Army. The attack was hampered from the start by appalling weather, deep snow drifts, and determined Soviet resistance, which slowed the armored advance. The German relief forces made significant progress, however, driving within a distance of only 48 kilometers from the edge of the Kessel. At this point, the success of the mission hinged entirely on the Sixth Army launching a simultaneous breakout attack to meet Manstein's forces. The necessary breakout order, codenamed Operation Thunderbolt, Donnerschlag, was never given by Field Marshal Paulus. Paulus was trapped between Hitler's explicit command to hold the fortress of Stalingrad and the reality of his army's total disintegration. He feared that a breakout attempt, which would require abandoning heavy equipment, would be seen as a direct act of disobedience to the Führer. The failure of the Sixth Army to move ultimately doomed Manstein's valiant but insufficient relief force. The Soviets, recognizing the imminent danger, rapidly diverted large reserves, including the powerful Second Guards Army, to halt Manstein's advance. The Soviet counterattack against the overextended relief column was fierce and decisive, pushing Manstein's tanks back from their closest point. By the end of December, Operation Winter Storm was clearly a failure, and Manstein was forced to withdraw his forces to prevent their own encirclement. The failure was a catastrophic blow to the morale of the trapped soldiers, who had listened anxiously for the sound of friendly tanks. The realization that no external help would arrive sealed the fate of the Sixth Army and turned the battle for the Kessel into a grim struggle for mere survival. The logistical impossibility of supplying both the relief force and the encircled army became painfully evident to the German high command. Manstein's failure was not due to a lack of effort or strategic skill, but rather the devastating combination of Hitler's irrational rigidity and the overwhelming Soviet response. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus was an intelligent, meticulously organized staff officer, not an experienced, decisive frontline commander. He was given command of the Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations, and was ultimately responsible for its fate at Stalingrad. Paulus's ordeal was a moral and operational trap, placed in an impossible situation by the contradictory orders of Adolf Hitler. He was a man who deeply valued loyalty and obedience, making his conflict with Hitler's irrational commands a personal catastrophe. From the moment of the encirclement, Paulus consistently obeyed Hitler's order to hold the city, refusing to attempt the necessary breakout. His adherence to the command cost him the opportunity to save a significant portion of his army during the brief window of Operation Winter Storm. As the weeks dragged on, Paulus's health deteriorated, and he became an increasingly isolated figure in his underground bunker command post. His reports to Hitler became desperate pleas for freedom of action, detailing the catastrophic loss of men to starvation, cold, and enemy fire. Hitler responded by promoting Paulus to field marshal in the final days of the battle, a thinly veiled expectation of a fight to the death and a suicide. No German field marshal had ever surrendered, a historical precedent Hitler intended Paulus to uphold by fighting until the last bullet or taking his own life. Paulus, however, saw no honorable military reason to sacrifice the lives of his remaining, hopelessly trapped soldiers in a futile gesture. The promotion failed to spur him into a final, suicidal stand, placing his duty to his men above the Führer's ideological demand. His command became a grim task of managing a dying army, a process of slow operational and human disintegration. He spent his final days authorizing the consumption of inedible materials and documenting the collapse of the logistical chain. The final Soviet offensive, Operation Ring, pushed the remnants of the Sixth Army into a shrinking area of the city, splitting the pocket in two. Paulus finally authorized the surrender of the southern pocket, including his own command post, on January 31, 1943. His surrender was viewed as a profound act of betrayal by Hitler, who never forgave him for failing to commit suicide. Paulus's failure to defy Hitler ultimately condemned his army, but his final act was one of humanity for his remaining troops. The true tragedy of Stalingrad lies in the horrific human cost, which extended far beyond the immediate battlefield statistics. The conditions inside the Kessel during the 67 days of encirclement defy easy description, becoming a symbol of human misery and military folly. Temperatures plummeted to as low as -40 degrees Celsius, turning every day into a brutal struggle against the environment itself. German soldiers, inadequately clothed for the extreme cold, suffered from mass frostbite, with thousands losing limbs or dying of exposure. The lack of proper food led to widespread, agonizing starvation, forcing men to eat their horses and, in desperate cases, even engaging in cannibalism. Wounded soldiers faced an unimaginable fate, lying for days in frozen, overcrowded medical caves without adequate treatment or pain relief. Typhus, dysentery, and other diseases spread rapidly through the unsanitary, confined spaces where the men huddled together for warmth. The sheer volume of death made proper burial impossible, with thousands of frozen corpses littering the ruins and snow-covered ground. The German Sixth Army effectively ceased to function as a cohesive fighting force, reduced to small, isolated groups of sick, starving, and freezing men. The psychological stress of continuous Soviet artillery bombardment, combined with the slow realization of their abandonment, shattered morale. The fighting became a matter of pure, primal survival, stripping away the veneer of military discipline and order. The Soviet forces, while better supplied, also suffered immense losses in the close quarters fighting within the city. The battle for Stalingrad is estimated to have caused a combined total of nearly 2 million casualties, including military and civilian deaths on both sides. The entire Soviet 62nd Army, which bore the brunt of the city defense, was almost completely destroyed and rebuilt multiple times during the campaign. For the Axis, nearly 150,000 men died during the battle before the surrender, and the final 91,000 captured men faced a terrible fate. Only about 5,000 of the German prisoners of war ever returned home from the Soviet labor camps after the war, a testament to the savagery of their captivity. Stalingrad was a meat grinder that consumed soldiers from dozens of nations, leaving behind a scarred, traumatized generation. The final Soviet offensive to crush the pocket, Operation Ring, began in January 1943, signaling the end of any hope for the Sixth Army. The Soviet armies, now well-equipped, well-fed, and operating with a massive numerical and material superiority, began to systematically reduce the Kessel. The German defensive perimeter shrank daily under a relentless barrage of artillery and repeated, coordinated infantry assaults. The remaining German soldiers, suffering from extreme exhaustion, starvation, and lack of ammunition, could offer only sporadic, localized resistance. The Kessel was eventually split into two distinct pockets, the smaller southern one centered around the main command bunker, and the larger northern one near the factory district. Field Marshal Paulus, operating from the basement of the GUM department store, was now functionally isolated from most of his remaining troops. The final days were a chaotic retreat into cellars and sewers, as organized command and control completely disintegrated. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the Führer promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a clear signal that he was expected to die fighting. The message accompanying the promotion reminded Paulus that no German field marshal had ever been taken alive, demanding a final, suicidal gesture. Paulus, however, chose to save the lives of his remaining men and, on the morning of January 31st, authorized the surrender of the southern pocket. He was found by Soviet soldiers in his bunker and was taken into captivity, marking the end of the decisive German presence in the city. The fighting in the northern pocket, under the command of General Strecker, continued for 3 more days, driven by a combination of desperation and disbelief. These final holdouts, frozen and starved, finally laid down their arms on February 2nd, 1943, bringing the horrific battle to a definitive close. The victorious Red Army was left to clear the vast, smoking ruins and take custody of the tens of thousands of defeated, miserable prisoners. The surrender of an entire German field army was an unimaginable disaster for the Wehrmacht and a turning point in the entire global conflict. The news was initially suppressed in Germany, but the scale of the defeat eventually became impossible to hide, plunging the German home front into a period of deep national mourning. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad on February 2nd, 1943, remains one of the most consequential single battles in the history of human conflict. It marked the definitive turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front, a point from which the German Wehrmacht never fully recovered. The destruction of the entire German Sixth Army and significant losses to other formations dealt an irreplaceable blow to German operational strength and manpower. The Wehrmacht lost its strategic initiative and was permanently forced onto the defensive, beginning the long, agonizing retreat back to Berlin. The moral and psychological impact of the victory on the Soviet Union and the Allied powers was immense, signifying that the seemingly unstoppable German war machine could be decisively defeated. The sheer tenacity of the Soviet defenders, often fighting with minimal resources, became a powerful national myth and a symbol of ultimate resilience. The German home front was shocked by the scale of the disaster, forcing the Nazi regime to finally declare a state of total war, to mobilize all remaining resources. Stalingrad immediately became a name of legend, a brutal metaphor for the suffering and the ultimate triumph of the Red Army. The ruined city itself was eventually rebuilt after the war, but the scars of the fighting, both physical and emotional, run deep through its history. The Mamayev Kurgan, a commanding hill that was the scene of the most ferocious fighting, was transformed into a colossal memorial complex to the defenders. The massive Motherland Call statue stands as a towering, powerful reminder of the sacrifices made in defense of the nation. The lessons learned at Stalingrad about urban warfare and the necessity of maintaining operational mobility and supply lines continue to influence military doctrine today. The folly of Hitler's rigid, politically driven military commands, culminating in the sacrifice of 250,000 men, became clear for all to see. Stalingrad was not just a battle won. It was an entire army destroyed, a grand strategy completely shattered, and the irreversible shift in the global balance of power. The city, once seen by the Wehrmacht as a quick conquest to secure an oil route, became the cemetery where the dreams of the Third Reich's expansion ultimately froze to death. The battle remains an eternal monument to the incredible endurance of the human spirit and the catastrophic price of strategic overconfidence.